Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you're listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
So I want to welcome you in today. We are continuing just our pursuit of Christ in looking over his shoulder and kind of figuratively looking around the room as he teaches. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 13. Last episode, we were in Luke 8, and there Jesus tells the story or the parable of the sower. And we processed that in the last episode, but we're going to transition. He tells this story in Matthew 13, and just some things that come up in the remainder of Matthew 13, just the way that fits, it flows better. And so we'll be there. So we'll be starting in verse 9 as he wrapped up that story. But before we start, I'm just curious. You'd already set the stage, Connor, for this story last episode, but anything that we would need to remember as we process this interaction that kind of Jesus now turns his attention specifically to his apostles.
Yeah, so I just want to point out and draw out a little bit at the beginning of this teaching that Jesus gives. There's this kind of aside that these are the things that Jesus is speaking. These are the things that Jesus is teaching as he goes from town to town. It's intermixed with his other teachings, other ministries of healing and all that good stuff. Yeah, I think it's important to remind ourselves, or even just to think a little bit about what it would be like as you have the truth of the Messiah being unveiled to you. If you're a disciple, if you're a follower of Jesus, and you are at the cutting forefront of this new movement of God, and there is this kind of weird, there seems to be this primary way that this Messiah likes to communicate, this primary way this guy likes to teach, and parables would not have been new for them at all. It was something very common both in Jewish literature and just in the day and age. And yet, there are still some questions for methodology. There's questions for specific meaning of what Jesus is getting after. And so I think it's important to remind ourselves to try to feel what it would be like if you've ever had a situation where maybe you were in a class setting, or you were in a internship and you were thrown in, and you're trying to you're going day to day, and you're walking alongside somebody in a career that you maybe want to be a part of, and you're trying to kind of get a glimpse of, well, why do they do this? Why do they do that? What's going on? And I just, that feeling, there's a couple of times in my life where I've had that feeling where it's like, I'm kind of like that internship where I'm walking alongside somebody who I know what they are doing, but I also don't know why they're doing what they're doing. And so I wonder, and that could be said for a lot of different times, but specifically this question that disciples get at, could that be a piece of how they're feeling?
Something that I don't relate to, but it's becoming more and more obvious to me, and I think it should be obvious anyway. I didn't notice it, is when they think of him as their rabbi. Now that's not groundbreaking what I just said, but I project how I think about Jesus. So they knew Jesus was different than the other rabbis because, number one, he chose them, and they'd already passed their window to be chosen by a rabbi in terms of age and development. His expectations clearly aren't the same expectations that other rabbis have. But it is fascinating because if, in fact, they view him as their rabbi, what you're saying is so important, because it's not enough to say, okay, here's what he did. You're thinking, I'm going to replace this guy, because that's the way the rabbinical system worked. And so, yeah, I really appreciate that, because their questions aren't random. They're just, I kind of get the feeling sometimes with the apostles, it's like, oh, now you're tuning in, but I think it's reasonable to think at least a percentage of them are paying close attention and asking, how does this work? Because that's exactly the question I would ask. If I'm working with somebody and envision someday I'm going to be doing this, so I need to know the why, not just the how of what's happening here.
That's awesome.
And so I'm going to start in verse 9. This is where Jesus wraps up his communication with the people. And so he's speaking to this crowd, and he ends with, whoever has ears, let them hear. And journeying through the rest of Matthew 13, beginning verse 10, The disciples came to him and asked, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" He replied, "Because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, because they see, and your ears, because they hear. For truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it." Now, he's about to jump into the interpretation. We're going to save that for the next episode. I just feel like there's some really fascinating concepts here that I think are truly amazing and perplexing. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just curious, Connor, what hits you first? What amazes you about this?
So this is a reverse of usually how I feel about the words of Jesus. The majority of this is perplexing to me. And I'm sure we'll talk about it plenty of ways I can work it out. But the thing that's amazing to me is specifically something that you drew on just right before you read. I think I have a natural instinct, and I've had it since I was a kid, that to not, and I think this is fairly common, I don't know how common it is throughout history. I don't know if it's more cultural or what it could be, but my natural disposition is if I lack any sort of knowledge, that it is a mark on me as a person, as a character flaw. It's a deficiency in me. And it is still incredibly hard for me to ask, even if you come up to me and say, "Hey, Connor, I want to teach you a quick lesson on rocket surgery." I will probably, most likely, if I'm in my normal state of mind, just kind of nod along, go, "Okay, yeah, that's okay, yeah," so like that, and like I'll try to kind of piece together, as opposed to just stopping and be like, "Hey, I'm gonna need you to start at like first grade level or kindergarten level here, and then build up and talk to me about this." So like asking for clarification, acknowledging that I'm like at ground zero is incredibly hard for me, because I think inherently there's something in me that believes to not have the knowledge of the master is a deficiency of me. And so I think there's a way this could go where my brain would assume, yes, the master's been amongst his people, the teacher's been amongst his people for long enough. And they don't even necessarily come and like, they're asking why you're teaching the way you're teaching, why you're going about your business the way you're going about your business. And my natural like the way I would think this would go in my mind, the way I pretend that this goes all the time is how God would look at me, is like a rebuke of the lack of knowledge. And so for me, it's just the fact that Jesus, because so often Jason, you and I are talking, like we want Jesus to be like, "Hey, sit down and explain it to us. Hey, sit down and look at the dumb disciples in their eyes and walk them through the steps of this, because they're clearly not getting it." And for this example, for them to like, when they take the time to ask him about it, Jesus is like, "Okay, let me walk you through it." Now, don't get me wrong, that Jesus does it this time, and it's incredibly perplexing for me what he actually said. So that's a kind of funny catch-22, is that I'm begging Jesus to do this all the time, and then these few times where he really does do it, I'm like, what in the world are you saying? But the beauty of it for me is that Jesus does that Jesus is not this version of the all-knowing master who looks down upon all of his students with maybe I think my thought is that sometimes the masters, the teachers, God have more this will be a kind of lame reference, but have more Professor Snape in them than I would. That's how I think most people actually are. I had not realized it, that I had kind of given that a little bit to Jesus in that expectation.
Mm-hmm. And it makes sense. Tim Rush, my coworker, he has often said that in American audiences, and I would say Western probably mindset audiences, the responsibilities on the teacher for the communication. In other cultures, and I think this one being one, the Israeli culture, the Jewish culture, the responsibilities on the hearer. And so even that changes, because I cannot even begin to imagine, and we've referenced this quite a few times, this concept, but I cannot begin to imagine I preach a lesson and somebody comes to me and they're like, yeah, hey, I don't know what that meant. Like, I don't know what you said. Like, I would, number one, I'd either have to say, just honestly, you're dumb, or I'm dumb. Like, somebody's got to be dumb. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's the wording that I was looking at. Thank you.
It's almost like there's got to be a winner or loser here, and that's kind of this scarcity mentality. And,
I think that's going to be the name of the podcast. Somebody's got to. That's going to be the name of this episode. Somebody's got to be dumb.
Somebody's got to be dumb here, and that's the thing is, like, I put myself in the spot of the apostles. I'm sitting there. And especially what we're talking about earlier, it's like, I want to do this well. So I think he's going to have a profound answer. And maybe you've had this experience where you think, I've got to figure this out. I had this at my Bible school. And there was a lot of great things I learned at Bible school. But one of the more frustrating things was, and I went to a seminary, and then I also went to a college, which was a separate dynamic. But, or I guess preaching school and then to a college. But I remember how disappointed I was when I would have very direct questions on certain things that for whatever reason hadn't been answered, and I go talk to the guy, they wouldn't know, and I'm like, oh goodness, and then I'd be like, am I too dumb to understand what they said? So this, I feel I'm projecting onto the apostles, even though he compliments them like us and them, and that's funny. Jesus creates us and them. It's like, yeah, they're not going to be able to see, which isn't a dumb, and that's probably the amazing piece is this odd emphasis, because we're talking about learning. He's doing this to teach them, but the emphasis is on the heart and not the mind, and that just clicked in my head. And I'm not suggesting there's nothing to learn with the mind, but basically what he's saying here, and I'm just coming up with this as we speak, is this idea of, he says, if you don't lead with the heart, you're not going to learn this. And that's a shocker. Yeah. Number one, because I was taught the heart is untrustworthy. You leave it out of the process. It's all supposed to be objective. And I remember hearing lessons on, the word of God is not subjective. That's not right. It's always got to be objective. And Jesus is like, yeah, no, it's not that way. It's like, now I get what they were saying is you can so easily read into the word of God and anything for that matter, what you want it to mean. And I do honor that piece, but it is this, he's saying, man, if your heart's not right, you're not even going to hear this right. It matters dramatically where your heart is. And it's funny because there's a friend of mine that Heather and I, we will text each other, voice text. And he texted this morning, and we're having these conversations. But this is what we're dealing with. And he and I and Heather, we've been pursuing Christ seriously for decades. But he says something that at face value is pretty basic, but it's like a breakthrough thought. And I immediately feel it. I'm so with you. And yet I've taught that 100 times. And yet I'm learning it in a way right now that I'd never known it before. And if you ask me to articulate what the difference is, I don't know, but it's as my heart is more open to God, I notice more and I feel it more. And I believe I think it more and think it better. But that's clearly not Jesus' goal here is get smarter. He doesn't say get smarter. And I think that's really important that we don't equate eyes to see and ears to hear as intelligence. It's all about willingness, or, a biblical word. It's all about submission. It's all about saying, God, I want you to teach me, which is the opposite of what you're expressing before, which is exactly like what I do. It's like, oh, if you were to dissect every argument I've ever had with my wife, Heather, so many would start with her saying, well, here's what you need to know. And maybe not those words, but you get the point. And I am like already mad at her. I don't care what she's going to say. Unless it is so mind-blowing, if I know 15% of it, I will not even listen to the other 85.
Because in those moments, your heart has become calloused.
That's exactly right. I'm on a defense mode. I'm not wanting to discover. I'm wanting to defend. And that's one way to think about this is that Jesus is saying, look, there are people that do not want to discover. They're just wanting to defend themselves. Now, he doesn't use those words, but it's like you said, the defensive went up. I'm looking at you. I'm sitting here. My ears are taking in sound, but I do not want to. And I just think that is...
well, and I think
it's really telling.
Yeah, and we've all run into that with ourselves or somebody else, and it could even be spiritual or non-spiritual, where like we're saying, Jason, the sky is blue, and they're hearing you say something completely different, and they're like, you feel like, okay, if I can just phrase this sentence or this idea in just the right way, like, and tailor it to them, then they'll finally begin to understand this simple thing that I'm trying to get to them. And no matter what you say, no matter how you phrase it, no matter like the inflection of your voice, it's just like, we are like, you almost feel like a separate species. And I'm wondering here in those moments, whether it's spiritual conversations, whether it's political, whether it's whatever it is, it's because their heart, and maybe even my heart towards them, because I'm primarily thinking them as a completely rational brain being, as opposed to a mostly heart forward being, and recognizing like when I'm trying to do that, am I callous towards them in their callousness towards me, or vice versa? And that like you drawing that out is so beautiful to me, because I think this teaching, like Jesus, they asked Jesus, like, well, why are you doing this teaching? And Jesus then expands this out to see, like, do you realize I'm not just teaching for information. I'm not just teaching for the content, but the actual way that I'm teaching is a way that you become, is a way that you go about the world as a follower of me.
Yeah. And I want to be clear on this piece, and maybe it is crystal clear, but it gets a little bit muddy to me sometimes. What we're not talking about is Jesus not saying, hey, you need to follow your heart. Mm-hmm. Your heart only has what your mind has taught it, but your heart is that gateway of whether you learn. How many students, so we're in the weeks of August, a bunch of schools started, if you go into school and you're like, I already know this. What you're doing is your heart is shutting down your ability to learn, because you're like, I don't like this teacher. I don't like this school. Nobody has anything to teach me, any of those things. So what he's saying is they're not willing to submit their heart, their passion, their dreams, their whatever. And that's the part of, so he's not saying, man, if these were just more whimsical people, they'd be awesome, or they're more artistic people. He's not saying that, or even if they were more in touch with their emotions. But if you're not in touch with your emotions, you don't realize how your emotions are cutting off what God wants to do. Because a lot of times because you're scared. If I'm scared, I can hardly learn.
Yeah.
So if I come to church and I'm scared, what will these people think? Is God really like me? I'm not learning much.
Yeah. And then the great lie of especially Western culture is we then justify that scaredness with rationality, with what we would say is rationality, with what we would say is objective, even not in terms of like beakers and chemicals, but we would objective scientific reasoning.
Right.
And I think the thing that most of us, I think we have to own, and I'll own this myself, most of the things positions I hold to in life, that I see as I've arrived there purely through rational thought and logical steps. Most of those things were worked through backwards to get to the logic, as opposed to progressing through the steps forward. And it's okay. I think thinking rationally is a beautiful thing. It's a great thing. That's how I tend to want to process the world is through my thoughts. But even people like me, like I have a pretty strong 5-wing on the Enneagram. Even people like me, we have to recognize that the great temptation for us is to delude ourselves into thinking that all the positions we hold, all the reasons we do things we do and believe the things we believe, purely come from a rational perspective. Like that's just. It's just false. It's not reality. And honestly, there's a part where you can, as somebody like me who, like, my wife is the complete opposite in terms of how she perceives and views the world. She's very much heart forward, and her battle is getting these, is getting the mental side of, because like she's just, where we are so opposite in how God has wired us. And so of course, like the things that are to my benefit are to her detriment and vice versa. But what I see is like, people like me, it's so easy to look at somebody who's that kind of heart forward person and be like, oh, do they not see how silly it can be, or how they haven't processed this through, when in reality, like, I have done the exact same thing in my heart, and I've become calloused to so many different ideas. And it's almost more dangerous because I've been able to trick myself that I haven't given to the whims of whimsy, or I haven't given to the whims of all these other things. And so, yeah, I think it's just important to own, as Western beings in this hyper rational society, that we are not nearly as clinical as we would like to be. And the good news is that God doesn't want that. That's not what God is calling us to be.
That's right. Yeah, and I think because of just the way culture works, humanity works, church structures work, it's like these are competing things. You're either intelligent and a thinking person, or you're a kind, emotional person, or you know what I mean, or you're a kind of tactile, hands-on, physical, get it done kind of person,
ethereal,
exactly.
philosophical,
Yeah, exactly, very mysterious and this kind of thing. And I will always come back to when Jesus says, "Look, God created you to love Him with these 4 parts of yourself." And I think that's just incredibly important to always bring that to bear to every passage, is Jesus is not demeaning other parts of yourself. And I think depending on your personality, you may be more leaned in to one aspect of Jesus than another. That's just the nature of things. But I think the person that primarily processes life through their heart, they're just as much of a disadvantage, because they don't stop listening because they're rationally thinking about something, but they want to feel something different. What Jesus is saying, I don't want to feel that. It doesn't match what I'm feeling, so I'm shifting. So everybody's being called to submit their heart, or else what we end up with is, well, I'm not strong with heart, so Jesus is probably not talking to me. Well, then based on the mathematics of this passage, then you're not getting healed, And so it's all about this idea. It's not like, well, that person's all heart, so they must be closer to God. That's similar to saying, well, that person's so smart, knows so much scripture, they must be closer to God. And it's like, that's not how it works. Yeah. Whatever is your strength, are you willing to submit it and have a heart that's submissive no matter what those strengths are? And that leads to really what is perplexing to me is that idea, and I love it, but it's that idea of when he talks about healing down in verse 15, the end of 15, where he says, I would heal them. And it's almost like this chain reaction. If they would choose to see and choose to hear, and then they would understand with their hearts and turn, and I perceive that as repentance. Not physically turning, of course, but the idea of, I held this view, but I'm willing to be taught something different. I'm turning in my understanding, and then they would heal them, which is a fascinating dynamic to me of how, if you want to say, how do you want to heal? And I think of this as spiritually primarily with implications to all these other parts of yourself, but it's like, it's not knowing the solution. And that's a really backwards thought in any problem you have, whether it's psychological, emotional, physical. The first thing you want to do is diagnosis. Let's get to the bottom of this, and it's like, okay, so how do I participate in this, God? And like most of my perplexions, it is, how do I apply this? But it's that idea, if I notice somebody troubled, and I'm saying every human being, because Jesus only came for the sick, right? But if I'm notice somebody is troubled, and I recognize I have influence over them, what is it I'm encouraging them to do? Submit their hearts, but it's really mysterious. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4, and you're done. It's not like take this pill. And there's a lot of metaphors out there about you got to take the pill to to receive this. But it is that idea of, it's trust me with this weird kind of concept. I have ears to hear now. Okay, now I'm understanding, not because of intellect, but because of a submission of my heart. Then I turn, and in some ways it's really simple, but when I really think about it, it's so nebulous. Like if I had a medical diagnosis this way, I'd be like, I got to find another doctor. I mean, unquestionably, like this is way too, what are we even talking about here? Mm. And it is that you're stepping into, and I guess I'm reminded of this, we tend to demystify everything, and I understand why we do, because we want answers. But when we really think it through, when the person says, I don't believe in God, you're sitting here and you're talking and you expect this God to hear your prayers and everybody else's prayers, it's ridiculous. And I just want to say that's true. From a human evaluation point, it is ridiculous. We're talking about somebody that's invisible. Are you serious? Like, you would get no traction on that. Like, who's your boss? And it's like, well, I work for this company. And like, what's he like? Well, he's invisible. I'm not talking to you anymore. You know what I mean? So it is, we need to recognize even having spiritual value, and I mean specifically Christ-centered spiritual value, valuing those things, that falls into the foolishness that God describes or Paul describes from God in 1 Corinthians 1. And I'm like, this process here back in Matthew 13, I don't know. You know, I know it exists because I believe him. So I don't even know it exists in that way, you know. But to the degree I know anything because he says it, I mean, he says it, but I'm just acknowledging it's pretty nebulous.
Yeah.
And what does it look like? And how do you know when it's done? And my understanding, and I could go deeper with that, but anyway, but that's my perplexion. It's like applying this. So I tell somebody to do this, okay.
Yeah. Well, what's the metric? You know, Jesus says, and I'd be interested to see what the Greek says, but they hardly hear with their ears, and so there's gradients in terms of how well this is happening. Like there's an honoring of the individual of like, hey, there's going to be like when you're thinking about this, when you're interacting with people, like there's going to be various degrees in which people are not hearing, and the various degrees in which people will not be seeing. So there's some beauty in that, but also like how do I think about if I'm speaking to somebody who is that closed off, and you're like, really, like. There's nothing that you could possibly tell me that's going to make an invisible guy with let's just go like the guy with a beard in the sky, you know, that's never going to make sense to me. Like who can sometimes heal but won't heal everybody, who can sometimes make food but won't feed everybody. I mean, all the things that we've all heard. Like when I'm thinking about that person, and like I have had that person in front of me, like how do I apply this? Like you said, that's always the perplexion. But then like, how do I think about, okay, there's a person in front of me, and there's a certain degree in which they are not at fault for the closedness of their heart. There's a certain degree that's the case, certain degree that's not the case. But then how do I think about them as people? Like, how do I think about them? Like, is part of what this can teach us, is there an element of like, man, I need to be thinking about these people in ways that I would think about somebody that I came into contact with a disability. Like, and I'm not saying that in like in a less than sort of way, but like my wife, she speaks sign language, and so when she comes into contact with somebody that can't hear, she changes the way that she communicates. She changes the way she approaches a relationship, a conversation with that person. And I think I wonder for us, like, has the legacy of modern Western Christianity been the people who, when we hear somebody says in front of us, "Oh, I'm deaf, I can't hear," we just yell louder? Has that been our natural posture towards people who can't hear and who can't see?
Yeah, that is interesting, because in 16 he said, "Blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears hear." These people long to hear what you heard. You know, these prophets did. There's no, how do I say this? And I'm looking to see, am I right about this? But there's no specific condemnation. Like, I read in, they're disappointing or they're less. He's not saying they'll never hear. He's talking about right now in the present, and they're present. But it's like they become callous. So I'm not suggesting that's honorable, and they've closed their eyes. But it's not like he's like, these people are too far gone. Mm-hmm. So I guess my question is, and this just deals with the whole perplexion of this concept, is that idea of, okay, so somebody brings their friend to church, and this happens all the time. And afterwards, they'll be like, "Man, I'm glad you taught that message today." Well, why? Because they think that person heard it, because they physically heard it, and they think it'll make a difference in their life, you know? And sometimes I'll follow up with that, sometimes I won't. It just depends on the situation. But it's like, how many people were brought in this particular crowd? "Oh, I want you to hear this Jesus. He's awesome. he teaches a parable about how not to be agriculturally, if you know anything about agriculture, and then it's it. Because keep in mind, only maybe 12, or maybe there's a bigger collection of disciples. They don't use the term apostles here. I don't know, 50 people in the entourage. You know, we know from the Luke version that there are some women in this group, most likely, that are counted in as disciples. So it is this fascinating dynamic of that's all they got. They came, they heard, they left. Mm-hmm. You know, the crowd did. And it's like, is there in this a calling? Like, is the confusion, is this going to bug them? Like, what's the intention? That's my whole point, is I can understand the part of, I taught this so you would ask me questions, disciples. What I don't understand is, what purpose does the parable serve to these people? Because he's saying, man, they would find healing. And that's what they're there for. And they're not going to find it now. Yeah. And I'm just like, is there any incremental steps here?
I do think there is a I mean, man, Jesus, he's a smart guy. There's so many layers here of what I wonder Jesus is doing. And I think that there's this piece where I tend to come, this is kind of where I land so often with what Jesus is doing in a specific situation, where, like, you talk about, like, they want healing, they want literal healing, and I'm sure there's some people, maybe they've heard the news that he's forgive some people's sins, and I'm sure that's drawn some people, and also probably pushed some people away. But I wonder, I do wonder if the one of the ways that Jesus is thinking about this and thinking through this is like, yeah, I could, you know, this person is coming and they have this sickness, and that's all that they're focused on. That's all they want to hear. And they want to hear somebody, or maybe the sickness is in their mind, man, if Rome would get out, if we could just get back to the way things were, if we could make Israel great again, then everything would be, you know, that's that's all that they can think about. And so that's what they're wanting from Jesus. And that's what that's what their expectation is for him. And so when they come to hear him, the thought is they have this thing that they think they need to get healed of, and then things will be good and things will be better. And I think this is, when somebody comes to Jesus, and we all go to Jesus like this occasionally, where we're like, if Jesus would just do this, if Jesus would just come through in this way, then things would be better. And in my life and in other people's lives that I've seen, when we go to Jesus wanting, or when we go to Jesus only being willing to hear certain things, or only wanting or only listening for certain things, what we're doing is we're making Jesus less than who he was. We're making him less than even we are. We're making him less than human. Like, if we go to Jesus and we are only okay with hearing certain things, if we go to Jesus expecting or only being okay with getting certain teaching, or getting certain healing, or getting certain new truths revealed to us, then ultimately, like, we're not valuing him in the same way that, like, I value you, Jason. Your words can change my perspective. They can, I trust you and I love you. My heart is not callous towards you. And so the things that you say have a deep, deep impact on me, and they change the way I perceive the world, God, myself, my marriage, all sorts of things. If Jesus doesn't have that same privilege in my life, then Jesus has become less than human to me. And if Jesus isn't human to me, if he's not a person, if he's not, you know, and still his divinity, if Jesus is less than you are to me, or less than my wife is to me, then I'm not getting Jesus. And I think I do wonder oftentimes in what Jesus is doing here is like, yeah, I could give them, they could get a part of what I'm saying. They could get a part of me, but like, I'm more than that. And not I'm more than that, and that like I deserve it, but like if they get a small piece of it, then they're going to miss out on. I don't know. How does that hit for you?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I love that too. And I would expand it to if the church impacts me more than Jesus. If this favorite preacher, my grandparents, whoever, I just think that's so good. And it relates to, what is it, Luke 14, where he talks about, which is so confusing, like hate your mother, hate your father, you know, and that's a comparative word there. But it is the spirit of what we're talking about, is that basically these apostles and these disciples, however big this group is, as they're listening. Now, here's what's fascinating is they don't understand either. That's a whole nother layer to this, but they don't understand, but they at least have the possibility. But the remainder are there, basically, they're there for something other than Jesus. Healing, wisdom, the thrill of the crowd, whatever it is that draws them. And in doing, they've closed off from Jesus. Whereas because I guess the carry through here, to carry this logically, again, we're talking about all the hard stuff, carry it logically, or else they would be there going, I didn't get it. Like, I didn't get this. And so I think there's something too about this dynamic of what does God expect when I hit something I don't understand? Number one, to understand that wasn't the main goal, which is weird. My main goal for you wasn't to understand me more. My main goal was for you to come to me more, trust me more, love me more, so I can heal you, and understanding may or may not come, and that's a really, I didn't learn that way. I wasn't taught to teach that way. I was taught to be clear and unquestionably objective, and Jesus is like the wisest person to walk the earth, wiser than Solomon, and he's espousing this idea of confusion works for us. I don't know what to do anymore, and I'm not distraught. I'm just saying I accept this to be what Jesus said. I accept there's deep truth here, and I'm owning I get a percentage of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is so good. We're actually running out of time, so I don't get to talk about what perplexes me.
I talked you out of it.
Yeah, but I which means now officially for this passage for all time until I record another podcast on it at some point that I have no questions and no confusion about it. So that's cool. If you, maybe we should start a service where if you no longer want to be confused about a thing in the Bible, you just come sit with us and then we box you out the conversation. Then you don't get to be confused after the mic ends. Right. That's how that works. That's how our minds work. But yeah, my prayer for you, and I assume Jason's prayer for you, is that your heart would not grow calloused towards Jesus, that you would see him in all the dignity that you want to be given as a person, as a human, and that we'd give him the same dignity as a person, as a human, as God. Because to do less than that is a shame to him, and it's ultimately more of a loss on our part. Grace, peace, and love.